Hi, everybody. I am just delighted to meet you. We are a community. I think we've been using Postman forever. Today, I will speak a little bit about Postman, but I want to tell you about our experience at Cisco with emulators. And how many of you are API providers? I mean, you build APIs for a living, and you publish them internally or externally. Okay, then that's perfect. You're on the right talk, my friends. Then a bit about myself. I'm Steve. You'll recognize my accent, maybe. I come from France. I'm an architect at DevNet. We are the Cisco's developer program, developer.cisco.com. You can get there. I'm part of the API experience group, and my job is to make your experience, the experience of our customers and partners, as best as possible, the developer experience. And I'm also responsible for the consistency across Cisco, working with all our APIs to make them more enjoyable and look similar. And that job is not easy. We've got more than 100 published APIs, means supported at customers for real-time business. And they do a lot of REST and JSON, but they also do WebSockets, WebEx, TCP, a lot of other protocols. We also have network devices, and those do some crazy protocols like netconf, RESTconf, and Yang. It's very interesting. If you're interested in data models, that Yang thing can be used largely. It's not only for network devices. It's really a grammar where you can create data models. All those APIs, they can be run on-prem, and for some products, they're also available on the cloud. Then, when we face all those types of APIs, they have something in common. They have something in common when you build them and when you consume them. And I think you will recognize that as you're all API providers or consumers. And generally, we are both, because you produce APIs and you consume others. Then, if you build those APIs, you want certainly a stable contract, and you want to avoid breaking compatibility. But at the same time, you need to bring new features on. And for that, you need to bring early access to your customers. And that's tricky. Okay? That's what kills us and takes us a lot of time. The second part is consuming the API. And now you're on this other side. And you're looking at that API, and you say, hey, I want to do some QA, I want to do some testing, but a lot of my code relies on those external APIs. And then you want also to automate, and then you want to add your code into a CI/CD pipeline. Now your CI/CD pipeline depends on the external API. Then these are all the reasons we keep facing those challenges, and this is where I was looking at these difficulties, and I came up, and we've been doing and working on several API emulators, and see how they could help us working on those difficulties. Then what would be an API emulator? And after, I will compare to other practices like virtualization and also mocking. Then for now, let's focus a bit on emulators. Then what's an emulator? It's a twin of your API. It's exactly the same, except you will recode it. Shoot, now I have to code it twice. OK, no worries. You won't code everything. You just want to code a specific use case. Then the one I'm going to present today will be very oriented around bots. But maybe if you're an e-commerce company, you just want to emulate your catalog. Or maybe it's your paying basket. OK, that's a feature, that's what you want to emulate. The only purpose is to help developers, to make them happy. There's nothing better than an happy developer. Do you agree? Yeah. OK, perfect. It doesn't need to be fully operational. Then no worries about the scale and all those stuff. But it has to be working. It has to be working exactly the same way as the original one. Doesn't need to implement all the features, and you focus on a few use cases. Then let's see how that works. Then emulators, they're not new. When I saw them growing was when we introduced serverless platforms. Remember the Google functions and the Amazon Lambda? When they started, you needed a way for a developer to debug locally and you couldn't be pushing your code to a cloud platform and being unable to debug anything. Then for the purpose of making developers happy, those emulators came. Then Google did theirs. And look at that, there's a disclaimer. This is not an official Google product. Right? It's always the best effort to please developers. And Amazon did exactly the same. This is a public beta. It has still been a public beta for years, and it will always stay public beta. And I will explain later what are the best practices, but this is some of the practices that inspired us when we started this work. And then the WebEx API emulator, what is it? It's an emulator for the WebEx API for the purpose of building and testing chatbots. WebEx, 300 million users, large platforms, and you don't want it to break, and you don't want the integrations built by developers all over the world to break. Then let's look now a bit about this API. This is REST. Okay, pretty easy. It's a chat system. Then you create a space, you put participants in a space, and you start sending messages in a space. As we all do REST here, you post to create, and you post to create a message, and you're done. And we have a mechanism of webhooks, standard webhooks. When something happens, you receive a notification. With that, this is the basis for bots, building bots. Post message, receive notifications, analyze the message, and send the message back. If we're able to emulate that with exactly the same payloads, you're good. You've got an emulator now, and everything's running locally on your machine or on a CI/CD server. Make sense? So the WebEx emulator, this API, it's not everything WebEx can do. You won't start a video call, you won't do an audio call, but you will do what you need to create a chatbot. Then think now about the use case. If you have got an API yourself, think about the use case of what you would want to emulate. We are at PostCon, and then so I created a PostCon bot. Never better. Then this is typically a chat system. And as we are now, this is our Postman, and hi everybody. Then this is typically the way some people would interact in a space. And as the WebEx platform, I'm working on the cloud right now. Then this is the WebEx client. I'm chatting. I can team up with other teammates. And then in that system, I can introduce bots, and I can have all this activity. But all that is happening in the cloud, and is synchronized with the client. Okay, no emulators yet. Of course, because this has a REST API, I can say, hey, I want to create a message, and you will recognize this is your favorite tool here. We are celebrating this tool, Postman. Yeah, I was the one that thought it was 10 years. Started in 2012. Then here, I just created a message, and by pressing this button, and you can see now I've got a card. This is the talk we're doing, and you can take a survey. Then what do you want to do? I'm familiar with those two, maybe. And I say, hi, everybody. Let's party. Okay, send, bam. Okay, cool, very good. And then you've got an answer. Your bot is listening. He's getting the message, a notification, and it pushes back the message to the WebEx cloud that goes down. And you've got the flow. Have you built any bot in the past? Bots are fun. It's a lot of APIs. It's a lot of learnings. They're interacting. It's pretty easy. You just send a bit of JSON, and you get an awesome result. And that is a bit of JSON, and it does all the formatting for you. Bots are really fun. This is the demo I just did. And now, the overall architecture, that's what happens in the cloud. Then you've got this WebEx platform that can support hundreds of millions of users. And whenever someone types something, it goes to the cloud. Your bot registers a webhook saying, whenever something's going to happen, please send me a message back to that public URL accessible from the cloud. First constraints, you need to be accessible from the cloud. And then sends a message back to answer the person that just sent that initial original message. Then this is the flow. Of course, to emulate that, the first thing you would do at the Postman, you would go to Postman, you will create a collection, and you will just mimic exactly the same flow. Then all the payloads going through, you will mimic them, and you will be able to automate what's going on. Once you've done that, you say, OK, I'm happy, my bot is working, WebEx Cloud is working, and this is where you say, now I want to go to CI/CD, and you certainly don't want to use anymore the WebEx Cloud platform, because that doesn't, you need the exact users, you will hit some rate limitation, you will need some licensing issues, certainly. Okay, then this is all the reason why you want your code to be able to test against an emulator. And that's the first use case. Then what will the emulator do in that use case? But basically, it will run now on your machine, not in the cloud anymore, or on the CI/CD platform. And you will be able to say, hey, you will build your own webhook system, creating a connection and posting a message. And now the URL, the public endpoint of your bot, where it receives notification, this one can be local. It doesn't need to be exposed anymore on the internet. And this will be typically your CI/CD platform. OK, so you take your favorite environment. Now you define maybe a few variables instead of going to the cloud. Remember just before? When I was there, I was eating the cloud. And now you want to eat localhost in your variables. And then you want to run your tests. And what you see is that when you go to the cloud on the top, of course, it takes 30 seconds to run the whole flow because you have to go back and forth. Now, when you run locally, it takes less than 1 second to run your whole collection, your whole test, your use case. And I know some people today are going to speak at their organization. They are working to have like hundreds or thousands of use cases like that. Then you want them to run quick. What's interesting also is that when I was looking at the total duration, and the average response time is about 16 milliseconds. Most of the time is spent in the test itself. And I do a lot of testing with, you know, those test features you have in Postman. We call them the pre-request script and test scripts. This is where you put your code, a bit of JavaScript, and this is the way you will know that your tests are passing, green, or they fail. That's the way also you can inject variables for the next request to succeed. Then, see, lots of time being spent now in the test itself, and no more ties in with an external platform, external API, and you can run and automate everything for your developers to be happy. OK, then that was an example. Now, how do you build an emulator? A bit of practices, because you may be interested to build your own. Then first thing, I like to always think big, but start very small as possible. Then you certainly want to focus on one use case. My first use case was to be able to push messages. That was my first day of hacking. I was very happy at the end of the day. I celebrated, I got a beer. And then I said, what am I going to build on the second day? And the second day, I said, now let's do the webhook, because now I will be able to do a bot all the end to end. And then that's maybe what's most important. It's you want to build it very, very quickly. Okay? You want to take a language you're familiar with. You don't want to care about scaling. You just want to mimic exactly the same payload, which means you certainly want to pick a low-level library, like being very close to the HTTP protocol, so that you can mimic exactly the same payloads than your original service is doing. Maybe you're using Spring Boot or something, or a complex system. You don't want to have all that complexity. I went to Node, and I took Express, and I coded everything on top of Express from scratch. And then I could mimic everything, because I had all the power to replicate exactly the same payloads. Which is fine, because now anybody in the world can take the emulator, run its bots against the emulator. And that's the purpose. The last part is, how are you going to see, because now it's another API, how are you going to know if it's really working for you? Well, validate it. Take your existing Postman collections and run them exactly on your emulator. and you're good to go. Then that's what I did. Picked a few, collection for cards, adaptive cards for bots, and the standard API from WebEx Teams. This is the one that is published today on the API network. And I picked exactly those two, and I put it in a new collection, called it the WebEx API Emulator, for the use case I wanted to mimic, and I was good to go. Then thanks, Postman. Then what are the benefits? All the testing for the CI/CD platform and toolchain, I think you got it. I spoke a lot about it. But also non-regression. Sometimes something is not working when you're using a cloud service. And you say, shoot, it was working yesterday. What have they changed on the back end? And now you've got you as an API provider, you give to your developers versions of your emulator. And they can come back and check, oh, it was working yesterday, what's the difference? And you can start doing a lot of QA. And that's very important, because all of that is happening in the back end. You can also experiment. Now, this feature I was showing, those cards, remember here? They got released like a few months ago, but I was able to give access to that feature weeks before it got released, because I coded those features into the emulator, and then we were able to say, hey, who wants to test it, so that we see if the design is okay. And that is another benefit for product teams, designers of teams. You can give access to your thoughts before your developers even code it, and you give it access to external developers. Okay? And the B plan, that happened to me a few times. You arrive somewhere, you don't have internet access. How do you work? How do you do training? Then I've been using the emulator a bit for some trainings. Schools or, some extreme environments. Now, how does it differ from a mock? Because I guess some of you are already doing mocking. Well, it's exactly the same purpose as a mock. Facilitate coding, creating functional tests, and creating demonstrations. Maybe the main difference, and I tried to, I created this slide just for you to get the picture, and we can improve it. I will be at the back of the room so that we can discuss all together. But basically, when you mock, you just do a few API calls, and you generally give a static answer. Okay, that won't work for a bot. The other option is to go with API service virtualization, API virtualization. This is where you mimic your whole service. Okay, you mimic all your specifications. That's a pretty large infrastructure to set up. Okay. Then in the API emulators are in between. They are dynamic, meaning that every time someone creates a message, it's got an ID, and you can delete this ID. There's nothing static in the emulator. It's not a mocking. And the good part is that now that you've got that emulator, you can also host it. Then now if you go to HeroQ, there's a version of the emulator running that anybody can test. Second thing, you can create your own toolsets. Then I use a lot Visual Studio Code, and you can add to Visual Studio Code your own environments on top of it, IDEs, and debug your code, like we did for serverless platforms. Another thing, maybe some of your product teams will be interested to introduce new features and use them, and produce them to users before they are released. Then to wrap it up, my message today is just start thinking about API emulators as a natural extension. Your API is a product, and you want your developers to be just using it and to be as much satisfied as possible. If they can't automate their code for some reason, at some point you won't scale. Okay, then think about that. Pick the use case that makes most sense, what needs to be in the CI/CD, what is strategic for you. Build it in days, hours, pick a technology you like, and put it in open source. Because then you will see a wide community you will start with a few API calls, and maybe some others will provide a few others. Okay? You don't want to spend too much time on the maintenance, and you want the community to bring from there. And then start observing the traction for it. If you like these kinds of things, I've got more than 100 repos. I love playing with code. That's a nice part of it. Sometimes you need just to be very hands-on. And that was a pleasure talking to you. I hope to meet you I will be here till end of day. Thank you very much.